It seems like no one agrees on how Ukraine's counteroffensive is going. Everything is great. It's going badly. Obviously, some of that is due to bad faith interpretations of the observable evidence. I know. Breaking news. Countries lie while in the middle of a war. Cue the Cold War irony about how the Pravda newspaper's name translates to truth. But I think that some of the disagreement is genuine. And the reason is a basic mathematical principle that somehow avoids getting much attention in school, even though the actual calculation behind it is fairly simple. And it is super important for all sorts of things beyond this stupid war. In 2 words, it is all about the prior beliefs. So sit back for a moment while we talk about the basic mathematical idea, the range of potential outcomes that Ukraine expected coming into the counteroffensive, how to feel about new information more generally, why prior beliefs matter for interpreting what is currently happening, and what good prior beliefs probably should have looked like entering the offensive. But we begin with the math. Oddly enough, Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane crash can help us with the idea. In the immediate aftermath, a fun conspiracy theory to think about was that perhaps Prigozhin was not actually on the plane, and therefore still alive. But then Russian officials declared that they had matched Prigozhin's DNA to someone on board. Conspiracy over, right? Probably not. I would guess that, regardless of how you felt about the conspiracy theory, you did not change your mind much based on what a Russian official said, or what the Kremlin released later. The reason is because you were applying the principle that is the subject of today's video. But sometimes the implications behind the logic are more subtle, which is why I'm currently occupying your valuable time. The classic example of this is in medical testing. To keep things relevant to recent events, suppose that a COVID test with a known 25% false positive rate and no possibility of a false negative resulted in the dreaded double line. What is the probability that the person actually has COVID? If you answered 75%, or 100% minus the 25% false positive rate, well, then you just fell into an oh-so-tempting trap. If you said that it could be anywhere between 0 and 100%, then congratulations, you just won this commemorative line on a map. Please press Print Screen and go to your nearest printer to redeem. To understand why this could go literally anywhere, ask yourself this. If the person taking the test was a time traveler who had just jumped here from the beaches of Normandy, you would probably want to change your answer to 0. In other words, it is an obvious false positive. And thus we are starting to see why the 25% false positive rate needs further context. To underscore that, if the person's nose were running like a fire hydrant, and they just spent the last 7 days rolling around in the used tissues of a coronavirus ward, well, for one thing, that is disgusting. But for another, suddenly near 100% is sounding like a good guess. Even more subtle things, like whether the individual had previously received a vaccine, should influence your expectation here. You may also want to know whether he just spent the prior 2 months on the front lines, in the middle of a winter war, spending way too much time exposing himself to the elements, and having his immune system be sabotaged in the process, and then spending way too much time in close quarters, next to potentially sick people, just so he can get warm. Get ready to hear more about that, because winter is coming sooner than it feels. Anyway, the problem here is that for the false positive rate from earlier to mean anything, we need to establish a prior belief that the individual is sick. Once we have that, say a skeptical 10%, then we can use a formula known as Bayes' rule, named after statistician Thomas Bayes, to calculate our updated belief that someone has COVID, conditional on having seen a positive test result. Okay, we are about to hit the deep end now. But not to worry. Learning the math right at this moment is not as important as just getting a general feeling for the problem. You can let the CIA handle the details, like they did during the Korean War. Apparently, it was critical enough to be classified. Or you can leave Bayes' rule to the British cryptologists, who used it to help decode the German Enigma machine during World War II. Anyway, ready? Now the fireworks can begin. Basically, you take the prior probability that the individual is sick, multiply that by the probability that they test positive conditional on being sick, which is 100% given the no false negatives assumption, and then divide that by the overall probability of testing positive, which is the sum of the previous calculation and the probability that the person is not sick, multiplied by the probability of testing positive conditional on that. Whew. Convert that to decimals, and the math works out to about 30.8%, which sounds pretty low given the tempting 75% guess from earlier. But that is what happens when you start with a low prior probability of illness. And to underscore how important that prior belief is, if you generalize it to X, the resulting quantity can literally go the whole range from 0 to 1. This, incidentally, is part of the reason why doctors are reluctant to do broad screenings for various diseases you may have. As long as the false positive rates are relatively high, such screenings will almost always come back positive for something, even though prior beliefs would suggest otherwise. Instead, you tend to get screened for something when the prior belief you have it is high, when false positives are unlikely to take you down a road of unnecessary fear and treatment. Anyway, if that last calculation was tricky, no need to hit the books and get back to studying math. The important takeaway is that you need to establish a prior belief to make sense of new information. Without those numbers, you cannot make sense of anything. Now that we have a basic understanding of the logic behind prior beliefs and updating information, let's take it to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Heading into the spring of 2023, there was a wide range of possible endgame outcomes, going from a surprise Russian takeover of Kyiv, to Russia entering the second tier of eastern oblasts, to Russia securing what has been annexed according to Russian law, to maintaining the status quo, to Ukraine beginning its march toward Azov, to Tokmak, to Melitopol, to a severed land bridge, to the January 2023 borders, to Crimea itself. As I speak now, the current line of control is about here, with Ukraine extending its coverage about 10 kilometers south in Zaporizhia. But note that I said current line of control, which is distinct from the endgame outcome that this figure is supposed to represent. From the perspective of trying to predict what will ultimately happen with the offensive, the current division is about as unhelpful as it possibly could be, because it leaves open a ton of possibilities. Obviously, the outcomes next to it are in play, but we have discussed before how roughly 2 months passed between the Allies' Normandy landings and substantial progress in France. The contemporary critiques were biting, but ultimately misleading. We are a little bit deeper into the counteroffensive in Ukraine, and it is possible that Kyiv just needs more time to shape a breakthrough. Russia still faces a shortage of warm bodies. Given that constraint, the sensible thing to do is to put a disproportionate percentage of them on the front, and leave fewer in the mobile secondary. The logic here is that the mobile secondary only matters if Ukraine commits to a vector, and the corresponding attack threatens, but simultaneously does not completely breach the front lines. Resetting the situation, if Russia puts too many in the secondary, punching through becomes a lot easier for Ukraine, and the Russian secondary cannot arrive before it's too late. What that means is that the punching through part will be the hardest for Ukraine, and the rest of the gains will come a lot easier afterward. That does not mean that a breakthrough is happening right now or will happen, just that it is hard to completely eliminate that possibility for the moment. On the other end of the spectrum, we can make some more progress. 3 new pieces of information are illuminating here. First, and still the biggest news story from the offensive, was the Wagner Thunder run from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow and its aftermath. Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group was the only entity within the Russian armed forces that made good offensive progress since the opening months of the war. Then Prigozhin's plane came tumbling down. And while it remains unclear exactly what the group is doing for the Kremlin post-crash, their mercenaries are no longer in a position to threaten Ukraine. Second, and related to that, is what happened since then in Bakhmut. After Wagner did the heavy lifting to capture the city between winter and spring 2023, Russia appeared to have follow-on opportunities pushing past the city and further to the northwest, at Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. But Wagner left the fray even before the mutiny, and Russia failed to go anywhere in that direction. Instead, Ukraine has captured the southern high ground and laid siege to the city, putting Russia in a position where its armed forces may need to pull out. Finally, Russia has attempted an offensive further north, trying to take advantage of Ukrainian concentrations to the south. That effort has not done much, further feeding the narrative that Russia has forever lost its offensive capacity. Putting these points together, Russia can hardly take Kyiv, and even expanding to control all territory under Russian law is doubtful, at least not without significant help from another broad mobilization. On the opposite end, Ukraine's hope of getting to Crimea this offensive is also doubtful given what has happened, and a fast return to the pre-invasion borders faces dim chances as well. The other outcomes, though, still remain in serious contention, perhaps to varying degrees. The real problem with making an inference is that if we are in the world where Ukraine will only gain a handful of kilometers total, we would be seeing just that right now. But many of the pathways by which the offensive will end at Tokmak look like this as well, and the same is true for a bunch of them that end at Melitopol. The reason that it is hard to draw an inference here is that we as observers simply do not see which is actually happening, because grinding away at the front lines to a stalemate looks very similar to grinding away at the front lines shortly before a full breakthrough. This leads to a question of how to feel about new information more generally. You usually get some form of this discussion of outcomes from the standard media, which then leads to various judgments of whether the counterattack is going well for Ukraine, and predictably blunt responses from Ukraine's press office. Hence the meme of "let Kyiv cook." In an absolute sense, I understand the critical perspective. If one defines success as reaching one of these end goals, they do not seem likely this season. But do you see the problem here? Thomas Bayes would like to remind you to think about this in terms of prior beliefs. I watch a lot of sports, and for me, as well as the vast majority of teams, what defines a successful season is not necessarily whether a championship is won. Maybe that is the case if you are a great team like the Chiefs, or Dodgers, or Warriors. Apologies to those of you outside of my freedom bubble. Those are some of our better teams here in the US. For those of you elsewhere, I guess you could insert Manchester United, the Chennai Super Kings, or whomever else you want to respectfully tell me about in the comments section. These teams are special because they have prior expectations about those championships. Most teams do not have the same expectations. For them, just making the playoffs can count as a successful season. The same principle also applies to how someone should interpret the success of the offensive. In that light, whether you view the offensive as a success or not depends on your prior beliefs coming into the spring of 2023. This can lead two people who agree on what has happened to nonetheless disagree on whether it is bad news for Ukraine. For example, suppose that you had relatively diffuse prior beliefs at the start of the counteroffensive, with each of these dots representing an equal quantity of probability. The new information would remove possibilities from the left end of the spectrum and tamper down some on the right. But the average outcome has moved favorably toward Ukraine. Thus, this phase of the war has been a success for Kyiv, even though only a little territory has changed hands thus far. But that assumes that you had these beliefs to start with. In contrast, if your prior beliefs held that the odds of serious Russian gains were low, and placed heavy probabilities on Ukraine making major advances, then even with the runaway success outcome still possible, the average outcome has moved in Russia's favor, and thus the offensive is a failure for Ukraine. Consequently, two people can agree on the new information coming in, but still disagree on what it means for the overall war. This raises an important final question. What should have sensible priors looked like before the offensive began? In other words, where would a savvy bettor's chips have gone across this board back in March of 2023? Deep Russian gains were already exceptionally unlikely, given what we had observed following Russia's May 2022 withdrawal from the center of Ukraine, and Moscow's need to mobilize further soldiers thereafter. As such, despite the surprising nature of the Wagner mutiny, it ought to have had little impact on those extreme outcomes, given how improbable they were at the start. Instead, the main change is in foreclosing some of the more moderately favorable outcomes to Russia, given their higher degree of likelihood entering the offensive. On the opposite side of the spectrum, optimism may have gotten the best of some Western observers. Part of this was justified. Ukraine had waited through the winter months to deploy NATO-trained troops, with the expectation that the corresponding new tactics would give Ukraine a leg up on Russia. However, that failed to come to pass. Reports surfaced of Ukraine wanting to revert back to its older tactics, and a more general issue with employing the NATO Combined Arms playbook, when Ukraine lacks the air part of that. The silver lining for Kyiv is that the F-16s will start arriving, though it is going to be a while before they have an effect on the battlefield. But part of this was not justified. The casual war observer may have looked back to the 2022 counteroffensives, marveled at how fast they went, recognized that winter put a natural speed limit on things, but then anticipated that Ukraine would pick right back up come warm weather. What such a casual observer missed was that the Kharkiv and Kherson city fronts were relatively poorly defended, making them easier targets for an offensive. In contrast, Russia built the Surovikin line over the course of winter, a defensive belt named after Sergei Surovikin, that same general who disappeared following the Wagner mutiny, perhaps due to his complicity. In fact, Surovikin was the one advocating for a withdrawal from Kherson without a climactic battle, precisely so Russia could buy time to construct defenses. The Surovikin line did not make substantial gains for Ukraine impossible, but it did mean that the prior expectations going into the offensive should not have looked like this, but perhaps something closer to this. Whether updated beliefs in September 2023 that look like this are better or worse is a judgment call. But bear in mind that this is where the current line of control is, and that regressive outcomes for Ukraine are far less likely than progressive outcomes for Ukraine. And even major success remains plausible if a breakthrough in the Surovikin line snowballs. On the political side of the war, Kyiv made an effort at the beginning of the offensive to broadcast the difficulty of penetrating the line. What they did not want was an expectation that the offensive was going to be a relaxing walk on the beach, and that somehow Ukraine was just going to waltz right into Crimea, and then have Western observers interpret the failure to do so as evidence of Ukrainian incompetence, and then promptly see the West terminate all of its aid. However, as we are now witnessing, casual observers of the war are doing just that, which is part of the reason why the funding question keeps resurfacing. But you do not want to be a casual observer of this war, now do you? That's why you will be interested in my book on the causes of Russia's invasion. Check the video description for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Well, he's been found. It has been a fun ride for #Where's Surovikin, but the reports indicate that he is at home with his family. As such, we will be retiring this Easter egg, and it's a shame that no one appeared to have noticed his final romp as a witness to the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. I'm sure another hashtag will arrive soon enough in its place. We just need to be patient for the next major development in the war.